I apologize in advance as well as for the delay. Today's hearing will examine the human rights and governance situation in Ethiopia and the status of U.S. relations with Ethiopia. Given Ethiopia's important cooperation in opposing Islamic militants in Somalia, as well as its cooperation in other counterterrorism and peacekeeping efforts, the administration, however, has been reluctant, in my opinion, to seriously hold the Ethiopian government to account for persistent, egregious human rights violations, including the inability of the opposition political parties to function, restrictions on civil society organizations, journalists that prevent them from operating freely, and forced removals of citizens from their lands. I know they're raised, but my hope is that additional weight will be given. According to USAID's Assistant Administrator for East Africa, Earl Gast, and we're very delighted to have you here, USAID believes that open channels of communication with the Ethiopian government create opportunities to influence democracy, rights, and governance issues. And I know that is a very real and powerful belief, and it may work, but unfortunately we haven't seen the fruit. However, Amnesty International will testify today, and I quote, "Since 2005, the human rights situation in the country has deteriorated still further, with significantly increased restrictions placed on freedom of expression, association, and other rights. Sadly, the Ethiopian authorities have not acted in a vacuum during this period. According to Amnesty, the U.S. and others in the international community have failed to raise concern over the government's systematic violation of human rights and flouting of its international obligations. The failure to speak out and press for change has emboldened the government and has allowed Ethiopia to set a dangerous example for other governments in the region to emulate. It is critical that the United States and other members of the international community," Amnesty goes on, "to press the Ethiopian authorities to address human rights concerns and repeal and reform key legislation and policies," close quote. Amnesty also notes that in its testimony that for the Ethiopians held in detention, conditions continue to be extremely harsh. Torture is regularly reported to take place during interrogation, in the initial stages of detention, often before the detainees have access to their families or to legal representatives. Prisoners have been slapped, suspended from the walls and ceilings by their wrists, beaten with various objects, denied sleep, electrocuted, and had weights suspended from the genitalia. Solitary confinement for extended periods is often reported. Within prison facilities, sanitation was often reported to be poor. Amnesty International has received reports of medical resources being withheld and reports of deaths in custody. I would note parenthetically that I'll never forget in the 1980s, as a relatively new member of Congress, I was elected in 1981, reading Amnesty's report called Tortures in the 80s, and it talked about what was going on in certain African countries, including Ethiopia, and barbaric mistreatment of detainees. And sadly, as they will say today, it continues in Ethiopia today. Ethiopia is Africa's second most populous country after Nigeria, as we all know, and the United States considers its government to be an important development and regional security partner, as it is. Ethiopia plays a key leadership role in the region, hosts the African Union headquarters, and is a major troop contributor to UN peacekeeping operations. According to the State Department, the three pillars of bilateral relationship with Ethiopia are economic growth and development, democracy, governance, and human rights, and regional peace and security. Deputy Assistant Secretary for State and Human Rights and Labor Karen Hanrahan stated in October in a speech, "Advancing democracy and human rights is one of our highest priorities in our engagement with Ethiopia. Nevertheless, it has been difficult to get cooperation from the current and previous administrations in confronting the government of Ethiopia. And as you know, Ambassador Yamamoto, under the Bush administration, I actually introduced the Ethiopia Human Rights Act because of that lack of cooperation and that lack of progress. In June of 2005, following a contentious election in which Prime Minister Meles and his party seemed to suffer unexpected losses, demonstrators led by college students took to the streets to protest a delayed release of the election results. The government's reaction was to deploy snipers who shot and killed protesters and to jail hundreds of others. An increasingly violent response to protests took place in November of that year. The death toll resulting from both protests was approximately, or put at 193, but the numbers arrested has never been confirmed. In the summer of 2005, I traveled to Ethiopia along with Greg Simpkins to assess the situation and to meet with Prime Minister Meles, members of his government, political opposition leaders, including one of our witnesses today, Berhane Nege, civil society representatives, the religious community, and the diplomatic community as well. What I found was a government leader who was arrogant in his certainty that he could arrest his political opposition whenever and wherever he wanted. I also found a political opposition convinced that they had won a majority in the legislative elections of that year. Unfortunately, the government's view won the day, and I do say, Ambassador Yamamoto, I know you spoke out here as well as in Addis over and over again expressing the consternation and the opposition of the administration and, of course, of the State Department, and I always will thank you for that. Mr. Nege and other political leaders were arrested and held in jail for more than a year on charges that they had to continually be charged due to repeated failure to convict them. Some of them who managed to be released from jail found themselves forced to live outside the country, such as Mr. Nege. The political space for opposition parties, as you say in your testimony, is restricted. The imprisonment and prosecution of political prisoners has dissolved parties and caused reformulations that also weren't able to continue. Mr. Nega founded Ingbot 7, a new political party in Ethiopia, but 2 years ago it was declared a terrorist organization by the Meles government. And not only was it unable to operate openly, but Ethiopian journalists were prevented from reporting on the party or on its statements. Similarly, the government of Ethiopia, according to the State Department Human Rights Report, continued to imprison more than 400 opposition leaders, activists, and local journalists by the end of 2012, many on vague national security-related charges. As of 2011, the Ethiopian government had completed long-term cheap land leases on more than 3.6 million hectares, equivalent to the size of the Netherlands, mainly to large-scale foreign agricultural investors. In addition, 200 million hectares of land have since been made available to such leases to foreigners. An estimated 1.5 million Ethiopians in 4 regions have been displaced, many of them subject to a supposedly voluntary program known as villagization. Others displaced due to these land leases or because of major dam projects now reside in refugee camps in Kenya. Despite an unacceptable political and human rights environment in Ethiopia, we hold out some hope that the post-Meles government may yet change. I remember when you testified, Ambassador Yamamoto, in 2006, you talked about being at a crossroads, and the hopes for change were right back there with that hope for change. Earlier this month, thousands of Ethiopians protested political repression in the capital city of Addis. Under the late President Meles, such a show of defiance likely would have been met with official violence and snipers and mass arrests. But the government of the current Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, did not react that way, and this is an encouraging sign. Our witnesses today include the former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, the U.S. official in charge of our significant aid portfolio to Ethiopia, the former elected mayor of Addis, a member of the first U.S. delegation to meet with the current government, and a longtime Ethiopian activist on human rights. And I look forward to your testimonies and yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass.